May 1, 1960. A U-2 spy plane, flying at what its pilot believed was an unreachable altitude, is shot out of the sky over the Soviet Union. Its pilot, Francis Gary Powers, survives, is captured, and becomes a national humiliation played out on the world stage. If you've watched our video on that story, you already know how it ends. What you may not know is what it started. Because the moment that U-2 came down, one truth became impossible to ignore inside the CIA and the Air Force: altitude alone was no longer enough to keep a pilot safe. The next spy plane wouldn't just have to fly higher. It would have to fly so fast that nothing built by human hands could ever catch it. This is the story of the Lockheed SR-71 Blackbird, the fastest air-breathing aircraft ever built by any nation, in any era, to this day. The work had actually begun 2 years earlier, in 1958, inside a secretive Lockheed division with a strange nickname, Skunk Works. It was run by a man named Clarence Kelly Johnson, one of the most gifted aircraft designers America has ever produced. Johnson had already designed the U-2 itself. Now the CIA came back to him with an almost impossible request: build a plane that can't be shot down, and build it fast. Powers' shoot down, just as Johnson's team was deep in the design process, only confirmed what they already suspected: this new aircraft had to outrun the problem entirely, not just outclimb it. 11 different design drafts were drawn and rejected in 10 months. The design that finally survived was called the A-12, the direct ancestor of the aircraft that would become the SR-71. It first flew in April 1962, from a dry lakebed in the Nevada desert so remote and so secret that the government simply called it Area 51. The Air Force's own version, longer, heavier, built for a two-person crew instead of one, first flew on December 22, 1964. By January 1966, the SR-71 was operational. Its name stood for Strategic Reconnaissance, and its crews had their own nickname for it, the Habu, after a venomous snake native to Okinawa, where the plane would fly some of its most sensitive missions. What Kelly Johnson's team had built defies easy description even now, 6 decades later. The SR-71 could sustain a cruising speed above Mach 3.2, more than 3 times the speed of sound, at altitudes above 85,000 feet, nearly 16 miles above the Earth. At that speed, the aircraft's own skin heated past 500 degrees Fahrenheit from air friction alone. Engineers built the airframe almost entirely from titanium, ironically much of it purchased secretly through third parties from the Soviet Union itself, the very country the plane was built to spy on, because titanium of that quality and quantity was nearly impossible to source anywhere else in the free world. The plane leaked fuel on the runway before every flight, by design, because its panels were built with gaps that would only seal shut once they expanded from the heat of high-speed flight. Pilots and their backseat reconnaissance systems officers wore full-pressure suits, nearly identical to what astronauts wore, because at operating altitude, unprotected human blood would boil. The Blackbird burned fuel so fast, between 36,000 and 44,000 pounds an hour, that it couldn't even take off with a full tank. It launched partially empty and refueled minutes later from a specially modified tanker. That tanker, the KC-135Q, existed for one purpose alone: to carry the SR-71's unique fuel, JP-7, a blend so stable it wouldn't ignite from a lit match dropped directly into it, engineered that way specifically so it wouldn't explode under the extreme heat of Mach 3 flight. The same fuel doubled as coolant, running through the airframe to help carry away the heat before it was ever burned in the engines. Roughly every 90 minutes in the air, a Blackbird crew had to find their tanker, slow down, and refuel in a precise, practiced rendezvous, because the aircraft that could outrun almost anything on Earth couldn't outrun its own thirst. Over its operational lifetime, the fleet flew 257 recorded operational missions and nearly 3,000 total flight hours, launched mainly out of three bases: Beale Air Force Base in California, Kadena Air Base in Okinawa, and RAF Mildenhall in England. And then there was the plane's single greatest piece of engineering genius: it was never designed to outmaneuver a missile. It was designed to outrun one. Cruising at nearly 2,200 miles per hour, if a Blackbird's crew detected a surface-to-air missile launch on their sensors, the standard evasive maneuver wasn't a turn or a dive. It was simple: push the throttles forward and accelerate away from it. In October 1973, when Egypt and Syria launched a surprise coordinated attack on Israel on the holiest day of the Jewish calendar, American reconnaissance satellites simply couldn't turn fast enough to make sense of what was unfolding on the ground. A Blackbird crew flew a single mission lasting more than 11 hours, refueling 6 separate times in the air, spending over 5 hours above Mach 3, just to photograph the battle lines across the Sinai and the Golan Heights. The photographs they brought back helped both Washington and Israel understand the true shape of a war that, at the time, genuinely threatened to pull the two Cold War superpowers into direct confrontation. The crew was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross. Few Americans watching the news that October ever knew the mission happened at all. Over more than 3 decades of operational missions, flying over hostile airspace in Vietnam, North Korea, the Middle East, Cuba, and Soviet-aligned territory around the world, the SR-71 had missiles fired at it well over 1,000 times. It was hit, struck, or shot down exactly 0 times. Every single SR-71 ever lost, 12 aircraft over the program's history, was lost to mechanical failure or accident, never once to enemy fire. But never shot down doesn't mean the Blackbird never came close to killing the people who flew it, including in ways no enemy missile ever could. On January 25, 1966, less than a year after the plane entered service, test pilot Bill Weaver and flight test specialist Jim Swayer took off from Edwards Air Force Base on what should have been a routine evaluation flight. They climbed to 78,000 feet and accelerated to Mach 3.2, testing procedures meant to improve the aircraft's high-speed performance. Then the right engine's air intake system malfunctioned, what pilots call an inlet unstart, and the aircraft began to violently pitch and roll, faster than either man could react. Weaver later said the G-forces built so fast that his own words became unintelligible even to himself, confirmed afterward by the cockpit voice recorder. Then, in his words, the airplane literally disintegrated around them. Weaver blacked out from the force of it, and when he came to, he assumed he had died, that nothing built by human hands could break apart that violently at 3 times the speed of sound and leave anyone alive to describe it. He hadn't died. He had been thrown clear of the wreckage while still strapped into his seat, and the plane's specialized parachute system deployed automatically, exactly as designed, even though neither man had time to consciously trigger their own ejection. Weaver regained full consciousness in freefall, his faceplate iced over, with no idea how high he still was or how long he had until he hit the ground. He landed, alive, in a New Mexico field, and was found within minutes by a rancher who happened to be flying his own small helicopter nearby. His colleague, Jim Swayer, was not as fortunate. The same violent breakup that spared Weaver had broken Swayer's neck instantly. He remains, to this day, the only fatality in the entire history of the SR-71 program. Of the 11 other Blackbirds lost over the decades, to engine failures, structural stress, and the sheer unforgiving physics of flying that fast, every single crew member ejected and walked away alive. That record, across more than 3,000 hours of flight at the very edge of what a human body and an aircraft could survive, says as much about the training and composure of the men who flew it as it does about the machine itself. It's a sobering fact worth sitting with. In more than 3 decades of flying the fastest aircraft ever built, into some of the most hostile airspace on Earth, the single life the program lost was taken not by an enemy, but by the sheer physical violence of the machine itself. The men who volunteered to fly it knew that risk, and flew it anyway. One of them was Major Brian Schul. Before he ever sat in the cockpit of an SR-71, Schul had already survived something most people wouldn't: over 212 combat missions during the Vietnam War, flying close air support in an aging propeller aircraft, until the day he was shot down. He suffered burns over much of his body so severe that doctors told him he would likely never fly again. He proved them wrong. He fought through years of surgery and recovery, returned to flight status, and years later was selected for one of the most demanding flying assignments the Air Force had to offer, the SR-71 program. In April 1986, following a terrorist bombing in West Berlin that killed American soldiers, President Reagan ordered airstrikes against targets in Libya. Schul and his reconnaissance systems officer, Major Walter Watson, were assigned to fly directly over Libyan territory afterward to photograph the damage, deep inside airspace Libya's government had explicitly threatened to defend by force. Partway through the mission, Watson picked up missile launch signals on the aircraft's sensors. Surface-to-air missiles, capable of speeds approaching Mach 5, were being fired at them from below. Schul did the only thing the Blackbird was ever built to do in that moment: he pushed the throttles fully forward. Neither man could see the missiles. They could only fly the mathematics, trusting that their aircraft could out-accelerate anything Libya could put into the sky. Seconds later, they crossed safely out over the Mediterranean, untouched. It's a story Schul would later tell many times, in a memoir that also captured a much lighter moment from his years flying the world's fastest jet. Cruising over Southern California one afternoon, high above ordinary air traffic, Schul and Watson listened as several pilots, including a Navy fighter jet, took turns asking air traffic control for a readout of their ground speed, each trying to sound a little more impressive than the last. Finally, in his most matter-of-fact voice, Watson keyed the radio and asked Los Angeles Center for a ground speed check of their own. Without missing a beat, the controller read back a number so far beyond anything else on the frequency that, as Schul remembered it, no one said another word for a long while. It's a small moment, but it captures something real about what it meant to fly that airplane: total, quiet confidence, built on a machine that made the ordinary rules of flight simply not apply. By the late 1980s, satellite reconnaissance technology had advanced enough that some in the Pentagon argued the SR-71's mission could be done from space instead, at a fraction of the cost. In 1989, the Air Force officially retired the fleet. It didn't last. By 1995, gaps in the intelligence satellites could cover, combined with renewed strategic tension, brought a small number of Blackbirds back into active service for a few more years. The program was retired again for good in 1998, this time permanently, at least for the Air Force. NASA continued flying 2 examples for high-speed research for 1 more year, into 1999. The Blackbird's very last operational flight, in March 1990, became a piece of aviation history in its own right. Air Force pilots Lieutenant Colonel Ed Yielding and Colonel Joseph Vita flew a Blackbird from Los Angeles to Washington, D.C., on a retirement delivery flight to the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum. They covered the distance, roughly 2,300 miles, in just 64 minutes and 20 seconds, setting a transcontinental speed record that still stands. That's an average speed of well over 2,100 miles per hour, coast to coast, in an aircraft that first flew in 1964, using technology designed before Americans had even landed on the moon. More than a quarter of a century after its final flight, no other air-breathing, crewed aircraft, nothing built since, by any nation, publicly known, has broken the SR-71's absolute speed and altitude records. Kelly Johnson and his team, working with slide rules, hand-drawn blueprints, and metal that had to be smuggled out of the very country they were spying on, built a machine in the 1960s that the rest of the world still hasn't matched. It's easy to talk about a plane like this only in numbers: Mach 3.2, 85,000 feet, 64 minutes coast to coast. But the real story of the Blackbird isn't really about the metal at all. It's about a test pilot who was thrown clear of an exploding aircraft at 3 times the speed of sound and somehow lived to fly again. It's about the man beside him who didn't. It's about a burned, broken Vietnam veteran who was told he'd never fly again, and ended up piloting the fastest machine humanity had ever built. And it's about a decade-long answer to a single humiliating afternoon in 1960, when one American pilot found out the hard way that altitude wasn't enough to keep him safe. The men and women who designed, built, and flew the SR-71 didn't just build a faster airplane. They built a machine that made an entire category of danger, being caught, functionally obsolete, for as long as it flew. That's not just an engineering achievement. That's the kind of quiet, stubborn American ingenuity that doesn't ask for credit, doesn't wait for permission, and doesn't stop until the problem is actually solved.